So thank you very much for coming. I hope there'll be something of interest in this for you. This paper is very much a report on work in progress rather than a completed project. I years ago began writing a book about the early medieval kingdom of Mercia in 20th century literature and film, including, of course, in Tolkien. That project was making quite steady progress until I became head of English literature and creative writing and deputy head of the School of English Communication and Philosophy at Cardiff. And during 4 years in which I shouldered that burden, and another year in the middle during which I was instead briefly the school's director of postgraduate research, I had to sacrifice research time to much less pleasant duties. So during those 5 years, I made hardly any progress on the book, and the scholarly and broader cultural context for the research changed in ways that meant that what I had drafted needed quite considerable rethinking and rewriting. I was tempted to abandon the book, but as will become evident in the course of this paper, it has personal dimensions that made me reluctant simply to give up. My period as head of subject ended last August, and having also cleared my desk of some other research projects with deadlines that were giving them priority, I was fortunate to have a semester's research leave last semester in the autumn, in which I could work out whether and how to resurrect this book project. I had what I think was a breakthrough when I realized, though you may at the end of this paper decide it wasn't, but I think it was a breakthrough, when I realized that I might revitalize the project by putting the personal more firmly in the foreground of the discussion, making the relationship between scholarship and identity a theme of the book. So thanks to that semester of research leave, I feel like the project now has a fresh lease of life and it's back up and running. And the new approach I'm taking to the book, foregrounding the personal elements that inform and even inspire its scholarship and argument, doesn't come particularly easy to me. I don't find it particularly easy to write in that way. And so I'm taking advantage of invitations like this one to test drive this approach and see whether audiences think it works. So you are, in a sense, guinea pigs for this. The first publication arising from the research for this book was my debut contribution to film and television studies, an essay in an edited collection derived from a symposium in which I took part celebrating the film Penda's Fen at the BFI in London. I'll say a little bit more about that film in a moment, but you can see from the reference on this slide that the larger project does involve some collaboration with my brother, who trained as a photographer, although actually most of the photos on today's slides were taken by me rather than by him, and I certainly didn't train as a photographer. The paper I'm going to present mainly consists of material from a draft chapter of the book, which will be on Tolkien, but I'm going to begin with material from the book's introduction. And this very short opening extract is the draft opening of the book, and it explains how this film, Penda's Fen, inspired the whole project. So it started with an algorithm. In 2016, the BFI released a DVD and Blu-ray of David Rudkin and Alan Clark's 1974 television play, Penda's Fen. My previous purchases ensured that this promptly appeared as a recommendation on Amazon for me. I'd never heard of the film, but I was immediately intrigued because, as a medievalist, I knew about an early medieval king called Penda from the account of his reign by the 8th century historian Bede. The disc's arresting cover image and the promise of a film combining ancient legends, sexual awakening, and the music of Edward Elgar felt irresistible. So I ordered it. On this occasion, Amazon's algorithm not only perfectly predicted what I would enjoy watching and be willing to purchase, it also had the surely much less common effect of inspiring an academic research project. Penda's Fen is set in the period when it was broadcast on the BBC in the 1970s, not in the Middle Ages, but towards the end of the film, the 7th century king, Penda, comes back to life on the Malvern Hills of 20th century Worcestershire. His former kingdom has long ago been absorbed into a larger nation, for while ideas of Englishness are at the heart of Penda's Fen, King Penda was not a king of England. The Angles, Saxons and Jutes who arrived in Britain in the 5th century didn't form a single kingdom of the English until the 10th century. This is a rather rough and ready map. It was the best one I could find online. Before the 10th century, what is now England consisted of a varying number of smaller kingdoms, as many of you will be well aware, of which Penda's realm, Mercia, was one of the largest. Its extent fluctuated over the centuries, but Mercia covered roughly the area we now know as the Midlands, including the modern county of Worcestershire, in which the film of Penda's Fen is set. But a long-dead king need not return for the past to live in the present. In many places, the early medieval past remains visible today in what was once Mercia. And memories of this lost kingdom also live on in the work of several modern Midlands writers who, like David Rudkin, were inspired by their local landscape and its past. I had already briefly discussed Tolkien and Mercia in my book on Tolkien and Wales, and of course I'd also long known Geoffrey Hill's sequence of prose poems, Mercian Hymns. But encountering Rudkin's film led me to see that a book exploring how modern writers evoke a Mercian identity might resonate in the context of contemporary debate about Englishness and national and regional identity. Now, the chapter titles and their order are still a bit provisional, but the current plan for the book has 4 main chapters, each focused on a single writer, one of whom you can see is Tolkien. Parts of all of these chapters have been written, but none yet exists in a complete draft. You'll see Tolkien is only one writer in the book, and so the readership of the book won't necessarily be specialists in Tolkien, and that will explain why some of what I will be telling you this afternoon is stuff that you will know very well, but not every reader of my book will, so I hope you'll bear with me if I'm telling you things that you think I should know, you know. One of the attractions for me of the book is that I'm able to write about Tolkien in relation to and in the context of other writers with whom he is not very often considered. For example, Geoffrey Hill, a quite different kind of writer, the much less well-known Francis Brett Young, and David Rudkin, the writer of the script of Penda's Fen, a film. So also one of the attractions is a variety of different kinds of writing, poetry, mainly prose fiction, and screenwriting, I suppose. So what follows, the bulk of my paper, is a selection of some of the material from the chapter that will be about Tolkien, and it too begins with a personal anecdote. Some years ago, I was on a train from London, travelling with my parents back to their home after a day trip to the capital. As we approached our destination, a voice came over the speakers to announce that the next station stop is Honeybourne, alight here for Middle-earth. Now, British railway journeys are occasionally enlivened by a member of the train crew bringing individual whimsy to announcements, but on this occasion there was more truth in the joke than many passengers perhaps realised. In its original medieval forms, the term Middle-earth, of course, meant simply the world, but you can alight at any and every railway station to get there. The train conductor was, of course, alluding to Tolkien's modern revival of the term Middle-earth for the setting of his 2 best-known works of fiction, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. One assumes that the conductor associated the rapidly approaching Worcestershire village of Honeybourne specifically with the Shire, where hobbits live, rather than with other parts of Middle-earth, such as Gondor or Mordor. He may simply have thought the countryside around Honeybourne resembles what the Shire must look like, which it does. Or he may have thought that the village's name is reminiscent of Hobbit place names, as indeed it is. Or perhaps he was well informed enough to know that there are good reasons to associate this part of England with Tolkien and with Middle-earth. The Great Western Railway employee who amused us that evening is far from alone in associating Tolkien's fictional world with real places. Tolkien himself made a few such connections in letters or interviews, and fans, scholars and promoters of tourism have since suggested many more. I hope you can see this. I didn't really think about how well a map would be visible from the back of the room. But, my parents and I left the train at Honeybourne, but we had then to drive nearly 4 miles to the neighbouring village in which my parents have lived since 2008, in a house that has, however, been in our family since before I was born. Their village also has a name one could imagine encountering in the Shire, Mickleton. It lies beneath a prominent flat-topped hill at the northern end of the Cotswolds called Meon Hill. Looking out over the fertile plains of the Vale of Evesham to the west and towards Stratford-upon-Avon and Coventry to the northeast, Meon Hill seems ideally suited to be a defensive lookout and was indeed the site of a hill fort in the Iron Age. At present, the Wikipedia page about Mickleton, the village my parents live in, claims that Meon Hill is said to have inspired Tolkien's Weathertop from The Lord of the Rings. You don't need me to tell you that Weathertop Hill is where Strider takes his 4 hobbit companions in the hope of making a rendezvous with a Gandalf, but where instead they are attacked by a black riders. You can see the reference towards the end of this extract. When Sam Gamgee asks what Weathertop is, Strider describes it as a hill. It commands a wide view all around. A few days later, they see the hill for the first time. Way in the distance eastward, they could now see a line of hills. The highest of them was at the right of the line, and a little separated from the others. It had a conical top, slightly flattened at the summit. That is Weathertop, said Strider. When they're closer to the hill, Strider informs the hobbits that long before, in the first days of the North Kingdom, they built a great watchtower on Weathertop. Amon Sul, they called it. It was burned and broken, and nothing remains of it now but a tumbled ring. One can, I think, see why people might connect Weathertop with Meon Hill. Both hills have flat tops, though Meon's is rather more than slightly flattened at the summit. Both command wide views all around, both are crowned by the remains of an ancient fortification, and both stand slightly separated at the end of a line of hills, though Weathertop is the southernmost of the Weather Hills, whereas Meon Hill is the northern end of the Cotswolds. Nevertheless, I have been able to find no evidence that Tolkien himself made any connection between the two hills. If anybody does have any, I want to know it. Nor that he said or wrote anything to suggest that Weathertop was inspired by Meon. The Mickleton Wikipedia page cites in support of its claim only a 2018 article on 10 beautiful North Cotswold villages you need to visit from Cotswold Life magazine. That Cotswold Life article in turn offers no evidence at all for its assertion that Mickleton, the village, not Meon Hill specifically, is rumoured to be the inspiration behind Tolkien's Weathertop in Lord of the Rings. Now we'll see that Tolkien knew this area so well, I think he must surely have been aware of Meon Hill, but there seems to be no real evidence that he had it in mind when writing of Weathertop for all the similarities between them. It's a possibility, but other hills elsewhere have attracted similar claims for comparably appealing but inconclusive reasons. There's a contrast here with places more certainly inspirational for Tolkien, landscapes in his fictional world that Tolkien himself associated with real places. It's well known, for example, that the mill in Tolkien's childhood home of Sarehole, then in Worcestershire, now a suburb of Birmingham, inspired the old mill in Hobbiton. It's now become a tourist attraction from which no visitor can depart ignorant of that fact. Tolkien alludes to the mill in his foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, published in 1966, though significantly drawing attention to differences between the novel and its inspiration, at the same time as acknowledging the debt. I never liked the looks of the young miller, but his father, the old miller, had a black beard and he was not named Sandyman. When I visited Sarehole Mill on a research trip with my brother, we also went to see Perrott's Folly and the tower at Edgbaston Waterworks, 2 landmarks in Birmingham that are often said to have inspired the 2 towers, which in turn give their name to the second volume of The Lord of the Rings. The towers feature among 10 sites around Birmingham with more or less robust Tolkien connections that are featured in a leaflet for the Birmingham Tolkien Trail, which we picked up on our visit to the city. The leaflet notes that while living in Edgbaston, the young J.R.R. Tolkien would have been very familiar with two distinctive local landmarks, the 1758 Parrots Folly and the Victorian Edgbaston Waterworks chimney. It, however, goes no further than to say that the pair are said to have suggested Minas Morgul and Minas Tirith, the two towers of Gondor, after which the second volume of The Lord of the Rings is named. Now, John Garth has pointed out that these claims actually originated as recently as 1992. Tolkien didn't originally want The Lord of the Rings split into 3 volumes, and he only belatedly decided which of the various towers mentioned in the second volume were the two referred to in the title. As Garth tartly concludes, looking for the two towers that inspired him is a futile exercise. So, especially in the light of that remark, I need to make clear I am not arguing that Meon Hill must have been the inspiration for Weathertop in the way that Sarehole Mill inspired the old mill in Hobbiton. I want instead to take the identification of Meon with Weathertop as representative of the fact that readers of Tolkien, like our train's conductor, persistently seek to make connections between places in his fiction and the real landscapes with which he is known or believed to have been familiar. Whether the specific connections that readers make are correct or not, the fact that they feel impelled to make such connections is itself, I think, a noteworthy phenomenon. One reason they do this must be that, in Garth's words, as we travel with Tolkien's characters, we visit places that seem compellingly real. Some readers evidently feel the places seem so real they cannot possibly have been invented, even by a writer whose imaginative fertility they admire as much as they do Tolkien's. A further dimension to this desire to connect fictional and real worlds is suggested by an amusing account in Simon Horrobin's wonderful recent book on C.S. Lewis's Oxford, which I just recently read. He discusses sundry lampposts in Oxford, Cambridge, Malvern and Belfast that have been claimed more or mostly less plausibly to be the inspiration for the street furniture that Lucy Pevensey encounters after passing through the wardrobe into Narnia. Horrobin suggests that this kind of connecting of real places with fantasy locations becomes a way of enchanting this world, of endowing it with some of the quality enjoyed in the fantasy world. And I have to admit that even though I know of no good reason to think Tolkien was directly inspired by Meon Hill when inventing Weathertop, having had the connection suggested to me by even such dubious sources as Wikipedia and Cotswold Life magazine, I never now see the hill and never walk up or down it on a visit to my parents without it stirring in me memories of the Fellowship's encounter with ringwraiths. Well, whether justified in specific instances or not, the impulse to make connections between such places as Birmingham, Honeybourne or Mickleton with Middle-earth is authentically grounded in a real connection between the Shire and the West Midlands that arises from Tolkien's personal association with that part of England. And in that sense, my parents and I were well advised to alight at Honeybourne for Middle-earth. The train from London to Honeybourne brought us to a corner of the English West Midlands where 3 shires meet. The county boundaries have moved back and forth over time, but today Meon Hill is in the southwestern corner of Warwickshire, overlooking the village of Mickleton, which is the northernmost village in Gloucestershire. Nearby Honeybourne, however, lies in the Vale of Evesham in the county of Worcestershire. Though, as is often the case in border communities, the situation is actually a bit more complicated than that. Today's village of Honeybourne was created in 1953 by amalgamating 2 former parishes, the wonderfully named Cow Honeybourne, which was in Gloucestershire until 1931, and Church Honeybourne, which has always been in Worcestershire. I don't know, you probably can't see very well on it, but this dotted line is the county boundary. This is Gloucestershire, south of this, south here. There's Mickleton in Gloucestershire. Meon Hill is actually in Warwickshire, and Honeybourne is in Worcestershire. And Worcestershire, as most of you probably know, was the English shire that Tolkien regarded as home. Now, here I have to crave your indulgence for recounting some facts about Tolkien's biography that I am sure are very well known here, but which won't be known to everybody who reads the book that this is going to come in, and also which are important for the case I want to make. So it may be worth reminding you, even though you probably know these things. Tolkien, of course, was born in Bloemfontein in what's now South Africa. His parents, though, had come there from the English West Midlands. At the age of 3, Tolkien travelled to England with his mother and younger brother to visit his maternal grandparents who lived in King's Heath near Birmingham, but his father died suddenly in South Africa while they were away, and his mother decided to remain in England. And from then until he left home for university, Tolkien lived in the Birmingham area. The family moved several times between what were then separate villages that have since been absorbed by the conurbation, Sarehole, King's Heath and Moseley. They later settled in the suburb of Edgbaston, where the boys remained after the death of their mother in 1904, at first with a maternal aunt and later in rented accommodation organised by their guardian. The Tolkien side of the family had been established in the West Midlands since the time of Tolkien's paternal grandfather, though as the surname indicates, it was originally of German origin in 18th century Saxony. Given his father died when Tolkien was so young, it's understandable he should have identified more closely with his maternal background than with the inheritance implied by his surname. And his mother's family had long lived in the West Midlands. As Tolkien's biographer Humphrey Carpenter puts it, the origins of that side of his family were in the quiet Worcestershire town of Evesham, where Suffields had lived for many generations, and where I took this photo. In a letter of the 18th of March 1941 to his son Michael, Tolkien refers to the Incledon branch of his family. His mother Mabel's elder sister married an Incledon, and their 2 daughters were Tolkien's cousins. Tolkien explains they were the first members of his family whom his wife, that's Michael's mother, of course, met. It was to the Incledons, first of all my family, that your mother was introduced, and in Worcestershire too. For though a Tolkien by name, I am a Suffield by tastes, talents, and upbringing, and any corner of that county, that's to say Worcestershire, however fair or squalid, is in an indefinable way home to me, as no other part of the world is. Before the reorganisation of local government in 1974 made it the largest constituent of a new West Midlands metropolitan county, Birmingham was part of Warwickshire. However, as David Bratman has shown, when the young Tolkien lived in Sarehole, King's Heath and Moseley, those places were villages in the county of Worcestershire. Only when the family moved to Edgbaston in 1902 did Tolkien leave Worcestershire for Warwickshire. And it wasn't until 1911, when Tolkien went up to Oxford, that 30 square miles of Worcestershire that included Tolkien's earliest English homes in Sarehole, King's Heath and Moseley became part of Birmingham and so of Warwickshire. Tolkien maintained family connections with Worcestershire throughout his life. John Garth writes that Tolkien felt an umbilical connection with the Vale of Evesham, ancestral home of their mother's family, the Suffields. As he grew up and during his undergraduate years at Oxford, he delighted in train journeys here, which connects nicely with our train journey to Honeybourne, I think. During university vacations, Tolkien often stayed with his Incledon relatives in their cottage in Barnt Green, Worcestershire. Paintings he did of that cottage and surrounding area in 1913 can be seen on the website of the Tolkien estate. Another of Tolkien's maternal aunts, Jane Neve, had a farm at Dormston, Worcestershire, which gave its name, Bag End, to the home of the hobbits, Bilbo and Frodo Baggins. After the First World War, very importantly, Tolkien's brother Hilary acquired an orchard and market garden at Blackminster, a hamlet between Evesham and Honeybourne. So here's Honeybourne. Here's the train line that my parents and I were on. Here's Evesham, and Blackminster, where Hilary had his small holding, is in between them there. Tolkien visited his brother in Blackminster several times, taking his children in the family car from Oxford to the Vale of Evesham to see their uncle and cousins, and he apparently acknowledged that the Shire was partly based on memories of visiting this small holding. In Roverandom, a story written to entertain his children, Tolkien puns on Persia, Pershaw, alluding to the village of Pershaw, which is just the other side of Evesham, from Blackminster. Wayne Hammond, Christina Scull and John Garth have also connected Mr. Bliss, another story written for Tolkien's children, with the visits to Hilary and Blackminster. John Garth writes that Tolkien's delightful illustrations make it all look much like the Cotswold Hills between Oxfordshire and the Vale of Evesham. Such views can be had from the western edge of the Cotswolds around Broadway Tower, looking across Hilary country towards Breeden Hill and the heights of the Malverns and Wales. And he says Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull suggest Mr. Bliss may have been created during a visit to Hilary's. What John Garth here, I think, very happily calls Hilary country is precisely, as you can see from the map, precisely the area around Hangbourne where my parents and I were advised to alight for Middle-earth. Tolkien several times claimed that the creative writing for which he's now world famous was inspired by his sense of belonging to a particular place. At different times, that place was localised more or less precisely, sometimes as England, sometimes as the West Midlands, sometimes more narrowly as Worcestershire. Apologies for quoting this. I know it gets quoted far too often, but in his now much too frequently quoted letter to Milton Waldman in 1951, Tolkien writes of having been determined to construct a mythology which he could dedicate to England, to my country. And Tolkien reveals in the letter that he'd long regretted that England possessed no mythology of its own comparable to those of the Greeks, Celts, Scandinavians, Finns, and other peoples. And as you will recall, he explains that once upon a time, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, which I could dedicate to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality I desired, be redolent of our air, and so on. In 1956, Tolkien drafted a letter to a Mr. Thompson, which he similarly recalls setting himself to restore to the English an epic tradition and present them with a mythology of their own. And of course, in his pioneering biography of Tolkien, Humphrey Carpenter was inspired by these statements to write of Tolkien's desire to create a mythology for England. Carpenter's reformulation of Tolkien's words has proved popular with later writers and has prompted a series of scholarly publications examining whether it's an appropriate or adequate description of Tolkien's undertaking. And Tolkien's determination to rectify this lack of a mythology has been compared to 19th century projects, such as the fairy tale collection of the Brothers Grimm in Germany and Elias Lönnrot's creation of the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala. While Tolkien wrote of dedicating his mythology to England, we have seen that he also referred more specifically to Worcestershire as, in an indefinable way, home to me, as no other part of the world is. But rather than these modern geographical entities, Tolkien at other times associated himself and his work with early medieval kingdoms that preceded the creation of a single kingdom of England in the 10th century. Either Mercia, which covered roughly the area of the modern Midlands, or Hwicce, a much smaller kingdom absorbed into Mercia during the 7th and 8th centuries. Now, for Lönnrot and the Grimms, creating a national mythology involved quarrying oral traditions from the past for materials with which to create texts for modern readers. Tolkien also, of course, drew on sources from the past, and indeed he was at home not only in a particular part of England, but also in a particular period, the Middle Ages. In recent decades, a productive academic subfield has developed to study what's known as medievalism, the post-medieval reception and influence of the medieval. Many modern writers, of course, have been inspired by medieval literature or history and drawn on it in their creative work. But Tolkien's unusual in having been not only a remarkably successful creative writer, but also an eminent and influential professional scholar of the Middle Ages. And I want to talk about those two elements, scholarship and creative writing, in relation to this sense of being at home in the West Midlands or Mercia. The narrator of Tolkien's Farmer Giles of Ham dates that story to those days now long ago when this island was still happily divided into many kingdoms. The adverb happily is telling here. It accords with other evidence for Tolkien's preference for the local or regional over the national or global. When Tolkien wishes to identify as rooted in the West Midlands, it's to the historical kingdom of Mercia that he often chooses to refer. He thus links his sense of being at home in a particular place with his professional expertise in the language and literature of the medieval period. On one notable occasion, Tolkien invokes the lost kingdom of Mercia in order to affirm the value of the local and of local history in the face of what we would now call globalization. In a letter to Christopher Tolkien in 1943, Tolkien bemoans the tendency to obliterate local differences in a uniform global culture, singling out the growing dominance of the English language as what he calls a damn shame. And he says, "I think I shall have to refuse to speak anything but Old Mercian." He would have been one of very few people who might actually have been able to fulfill that threat. After his rigorous philological education, during his academic career, Tolkien, of course, taught Old and Middle English language and literature, as well as related medieval Germanic languages. He connected his academic interests in early English language and literature with his personal and family ties to the West Midlands. And he seems to have been particularly concerned to do this around the time of the publication of The Lord of the Rings in 1954 to 55. Near the beginning of his 1955 O'Donnell lecture on English and Welsh, delivered in Oxford the day after publication of the final volume of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien explains he's not an academic specialist in Celtic languages, but rather a philologist in the Anglo-Saxon and Germanic field, indeed a Saxon in Welsh terms, he's alluding there to Welsh Saesneg, or, in our own, one of the English of Mercia. In a slightly earlier letter of the 17th of June 1955 to W.H. Auden, Tolkien writes that I am a West Midlander by blood and took to early West Midland Middle English as a known tongue as soon as I set eyes on it. He makes a similarly dubious link between genetics and aptitude for medieval dialect. In another 1955 letter, he wrote to his American publisher that I am in fact more of a Suffield, a family derived from Evesham in Worcestershire, than a Tolkien. I am indeed, in English terms, a West Midlander, at home only in the counties upon the Welsh marches, and it is, I believe, as much due to descent as to opportunity that Anglo-Saxon and Western Middle English and alliterative verse have been both a childhood attraction and my main professional sphere. When Tolkien describes himself here as at home in the counties on the Welsh marches, he is very well aware that the term marches, denoting the counties on the Anglo-Welsh border, is related to the name of the early English kingdom of Mercia. The modern English word Mercia, borrowed from the Latin adaptation of Old English mearc, a word that doesn't actually survive in any text, but can be extrapolated from the surviving word mirch or mirch, meaning Mercians. And the equivalent of West Saxon mearc in the Old Mercian dialect of the Mercians themselves would have been mark. This name indicates the land of a border or boundary people, so is appropriate to the people on the border with Wales, or the Welsh. And I'll return to this relationship between Mercia and Wales at the end of the paper. In the chapter of my book, I will also, but not today, I will also consider in more detail the implications of Tolkien's claims that descent and blood help to account for his interest in texts in the Old and Middle English dialects of the West Midlands. For now, I think the crucial point is Tolkien saw a connection between his personal history and the literary and linguistic areas in which he specialised as a university professor. This is one of my brother's photographs with the Malvern Hills in the background, I think taken from near Pershore, that side of Evesham. Not all of Tolkien's scholarship was dedicated to Mercian or medieval Midlands literature. John M. Bowers and Peter Stephenson have recently brought renewed attention to Tolkien's sustained and extensive work on Chaucer, for example, only a small proportion of it found its way into print, of course, in his lifetime. But much of Tolkien's academic work was indeed on medieval texts from the West Midlands, texts in the dialect which he claims to have taken like a native. In the letter I quoted earlier, Tolkien describes Anglo-Saxon and Western Middle English and alliterative verse as his main professional sphere. In doing so, he hints at a continuity, too, between early and later medieval periods in the West Midlands, Anglo-Saxon and Western Middle English, and alliterative verse. I think he's hinting at a cultural continuity there. That continuity from pre to post-Norman conquest England was indeed maintained most strongly in the western counties bordering Wales. The pre-conquest bishop to retain his see longest after 1066 was St Wulfstan of Worcester, who died in 1095, and Old English homiletic literature continued to be studied in Worcester well into the early Middle English period. Tolkien's work on Middle English literature from this area embraced prose as well as alliterative verse. His work on the handbook or rule for anchoresses called Ancrena Rula, especially the version known as Ancrena Wissa, includes his groundbreaking essay from 1929 arguing that the language of Ancrena Wissa was so carefully standardized and so closely identical to the language of a group of 5 religious texts preserved in manuscript Bodley 24 that the text must reflect a deliberate attempt to produce a standard written form of English. And Tolkien localized those texts to Herefordshire, though I think more recent scholarship has perhaps refined this to North Herefordshire or the southern tip of Shropshire. For many years, even more years than I think I've been writing this book, Tolkien was engaged on producing a diplomatic edition of Ancrena Wissa for the Early English Text Society, which was eventually published in 1962. But despite that crucial contribution to the study of early Middle English religious prose from the West Midlands, the main academic field on which Tolkien published was alliterative poetry in either Old or Middle English. I plan to discuss that scholarship on alliterative poetry in some detail in my book, but today I'm going to limit myself just to observing that Middle English alliterative poetry is especially associated with the West as well as with the North of England. And an example is provided by the Middle English poem on which Tolkien wrote most, the anonymous 14th century romance Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Tolkien and Evie Gordon, of course, collaborated on what's still in some ways the standard edition of that poem, first published in 1925. They maintain the dialect of the single surviving manuscript is from South Lancashire, which you could just about see as the north of the West Midlands, and they argue on the basis of the narrator's knowledge of the locality, that's also likely to have been the dialect of the anonymous poet. They say he seems to show detailed knowledge of the geography of North Wales and Wirral. Interestingly, in his posthumously published translation of the poem, Tolkien less specifically notes that the language, metre and scenery of the Gawain poet's work indicate that his home was in the West Midlands of England. Tolkien's deep personal and professional engagement with distinctive medieval literary traditions from the West Midlands, early Middle English religious prose, and Old and Middle English alliterative poetry, was thus entwined with his sense of a strong regional identity. Tom Shippey argues that 5 English counties formed the heartland of Tolkien's imagination, what he calls a cultural unit with deep roots in history. These are Worcestershire, Warwickshire, Staffordshire, Herefordshire and Shropshire. David Bratman would add to these the counties of Gloucestershire, Oxfordshire, Cheshire and South Lancashire. Shippey's 5 counties do, as I've suggested, correspond to the heartland of a recognisable literary tradition in the medieval period, in a way which isn't really true of Bratman's larger grouping, but that larger area corresponds closely to the political divisions of early medieval England, coinciding more or less with what's sometimes called English Mercia, the part of Mercia that didn't become the Danelaw after the Viking invasions and settlement. I personally, for various reasons, but partly for this one, I personally would want to associate Gloucestershire with Shippey's core counties of Worcestershire, Warwickshire, Staffordshire, Herefordshire and Shropshire, on the basis of its belonging with Worcestershire and part of Warwickshire to the kingdom of the Witcher, with which Tolkien specifically associated his maternal ancestry. Tolkien's scholarly expertise in the early medieval past led him sometimes to invoke a more narrowly localized identity than Mercian. In 1942, he assured his son Christopher that, barring the Tolkien, which must long ago have become a pretty thin strand, this is of course the German origin of the name, you are a Mercian or Whittian on both sides, meaning through both his paternal and maternal ancestors. Now, Whitshire was a small kingdom, roughly corresponding to most of modern Worcestershire and Gloucestershire, with part of Warwickshire. Again, take the map with a bit of a pinch of salt, but it gives you a rough idea. This small kingdom was absorbed into Mercia during the 7th and 8th centuries, although its separate identity, was to a limited extent preserved by the establishment of the Diocese of Worcester before 680. The diocese covered more or less the same territory as the former kingdom, and the bishops of Worcester held the title Episcopus Whitchiorum until the 10th century, long after the kingdom had ceased to exist. If we turn from Tolkien's scholarship to his creative writing, there are, I think, three main ways in which it connects with Tolkien's sense of his Mercian or West Midlands heritage and identity. Firstly, he made several attempts to link the imagined history of the world of the First and Second Ages, especially to the real history of England. Secondly, the culture and language of early medieval Mercia inspired the Riders of Rohan in The Lord of the Rings. And finally, Tolkien wrote original poetry in the alliterative metre that was used in Old English and in Middle English poetry of the alliterative revival. And as we've seen, Tolkien strongly linked this medieval alliterative poetry and his scholarly interest in it with the West Midlands. In the chapter of the book, I will discuss each of those three things in some detail, but for today's purposes, I'm going to restrict myself to some very brief summary comments. Verlin Flieger and John Garth, among others, have well documented the successive different ways in which Tolkien attempted to link the developing stories of his legendarium to present-day England, beginning in the early Book of Lost Tales with Ariel the Mariner as a reteller of tales heard on Tol Eressëa, through the later figure of Alfwine, an imaginary early English translator of annalistic material from Elvish into Old English, to Tolkien's experiments with time-travelling, a time-travelling link between modern England and the legendary past in The Lost Road and the Notion Club papers. Each of these different narrative devices that he was trying out can be seen as attempts to link his creative work with England. The most obvious influence, I think, of early medieval Mercia on Tolkien's fiction is seen in the Riders of Rohan, or Rohirrim, in The Lord of the Rings. Their realm is, of course, known as the Mark, a modern English word corresponding to Old Mercian Mark. The name of the kingdom of Mercia denoting the kingdom as a border or boundary people. And it's long been recognised that the personal place, horse and weapon names of the Riders of the Mark are Old English, and Tom Shippey has noted they are specifically Mercian forms, so that their name for the White Wizard, for example, is Saruman, and not, as it would have been in standard West Saxon, Searuman. And as befits a people modelled so closely on the early medieval English, the poetry of the Rohirrim is in alliterative metre, the metre used in all Old English poetry and in a large body of Middle English poetry, most of it associated with either the west or north of England. Tolkien, of course, wrote about 40 complete or fragmentary poems in alliterative metre, some in Old English, others using the metre for verse in modern English. I've written about some of that poetry elsewhere, and my chapter will discuss its relationship to Tolkien's identifying with Mercia and the West Midlands in some detail, but I'm not going to say much more about it now, nor am I going to say more about the fact that he also wrote in Old English, of course, including sometimes specifically in the Old Mercian, in which he threatened to restrict all his speech. Now, we've seen that many readers of Tolkien's Middle-earth fiction feel impelled to connect locations in that fictional world with real places. And we've also noted that Tolkien himself, in different ways, linked both his scholarly work and his fiction to the places, past and present, with which he identified: England, Worcestershire, Mercia, Whitshire. I am nowhere near as learned a scholar as Tolkien, and I've left it rather late to become a best-selling novelist. But for all the differences between us, in both cases, his and mine, personal and family history are interconnected with scholarly career. My own research project on Mercia in the modern imagination provides then, I think, a further example of the way in which personal history can inform scholarly research. Many people nowadays, including some of my own students, develop an interest in medieval literature after reading Tolkien's fiction. That may be true for some of you. They want to encounter the medieval texts that meant so much to him and were such important sources for his fiction. For me, it was the other way round. One of the set texts I studied at school for A-level English literature was Geoffrey Chaucer's Nun's Priest's Tale. And on that remarkably slender basis, I decided I wanted, even for my first degree, to specialise only in medieval literature. For me, one of the attractions of medieval literature was its linguistic difference from modern English. And I went to the University of Sheffield to do a BA in English language with medieval literature. I didn't read The Lord of the Rings until I was already in the second or third year of that degree, though I had read The Hobbit some time earlier. I thus came to Tolkien from studying some of his medieval sources, and partly because I knew of his interest in them, not the other way round. This may be why I always feel like a bit of an imposter when talking about Tolkien, particularly with an audience like this in front of me. But there we are. After I'd done postgraduate degrees here in Oxford, I, like Tolkien, became a university teacher of medieval literature. I also share with him a Mercian family background, though like him, I was born outside England, though not as far away from England as he was. In my case, I was born in Newport, South Wales, but at about the same age as Tolkien moved from South Africa to the West Midlands, I moved from Wales to the East Midlands, living in Leicestershire from the age of 3 until I went to university. Both my mother's and father's families are, however, firmly rooted in the west of what was once the Kingdom of Mercia. I am, therefore, like Christopher Tolkien, descended on both sides from families established for many generations in what was once Mercia, or more specifically, the territory of the Witcher. My mother's traced many different branches of the family back for 2 centuries or more in the West Midlands, primarily Gloucestershire, Warwickshire, and Worcestershire. As listed on this slide, these are various, the further you go back in the family, the more different branches and surnames you have. So these are the furthest back that Mum has got with the different branches of the family. And I've just put in bold the 4 who represent the earliest ancestors she's been able to track down that bear the surnames of my 4 grandparents. So William Phelpstead, married in Churchdown, Gloucestershire in 1803, Walter Tainton, baptised in Gloucester in 1651, John Bennet, married in Warwickshire in 1777, and John Court, married in Gloucestershire in 1735. I returned to the land of my birth shortly after completing my doctorate at Oxford, and I've lived in Cardiff ever since. After I'd published a little bit about the influence of medieval English material on Tolkien's writing, I was approached by the University of Wales Press quite a few years ago now about writing a book about Tolkien and Wales. They actually asked me if I knew anybody who would be able to write such a book. They didn't actually ask me if I wanted to write it, and I'm never quite sure whether that was a roundabout way of asking me, or whether they didn't expect me to say, yes, I'll do it, but I sort of did say I would do it. Being born and living in Wales, but being descended from West Midland or Mercian families long resident in neighbouring Midlands counties gave me a sense of affinity with that topic of Tolkien and Wales. And I argued in the last main chapter of that book that Tolkien's sense of being Mercian related to his love of Wales. For Tolkien, his Mercian identity is a border identity, and this is, of course, what the name means. In the 1955 letter to his American publisher, he describes himself as a West Midlander at home only in the counties upon the Welsh marches. In prefatory comments he provided for M.B. Sally's modern English translation of Anchor and Owissa, Tolkien similarly says of the early Middle English dialect of that text that the soil in which it grew was that of the West Midlands and the marches of Wales. And As I've suggested, when employing the term marches, Tolkien will always have been aware of its etymological relationship to the name of the kingdom of Mercia, and of course to the name of the Mark of Rohan in The Lord of the Rings. After identifying as one of the English of Mercia in his O'Donnell lecture on English and Welsh, he qualified this by claiming to be one who has always felt the attraction of the ancient history and prehistory of these islands, and most particularly the attraction of the Welsh language in itself. As with all the West Midlands authors who are discussed in the book I'm writing, there is a Welsh-related dimension to Tolkien's sense of belonging to Mercia. Borders define, but by doing so, they inevitably also put what is on each side of them into a particular kind of relationship. So one can argue that borders join as much as they separate. Now, R.S. Ryan draws attention to the use in England of the topographical term the edge to refer to dangerous wild places that are often wooded, sparsely inhabited hills and uplands. And he refers to the notion of the edge as, quote, a local boundary between the known and so safe and the other that it would certainly be wiser and safer not to pass into. He suggests that Tolkien echoes such usage when Gandalf tells Bilbo and the dwarves in The Hobbit that there are no safe paths in this part of the world. Remember, you are over the edge of the wild now. As it happens, 2 villages just south of where my parents and I were advised to alight for Middle-earth at Honeybourne include the element edge in their names. Aston Subbage is so small that it doesn't actually appear on the map, but Western Subbage does. Aston Subbage is just about here, actually, but Western Subbage does appear on that map. And they're just south of Honeybourne, where we got off the train, and Mickleton is just over there. My maternal grandparents lived for many years in Western Subbage, as did a great aunt of mine who wrote the history of the village, explaining its name in her book's quaintly didactic subtitle, Western Subbage, the Cotswold village lying below its famous edge, Dover's Hill. That's a great title, I think. Dover's Hill is part of the northwest of the Cotswold Range, just south of Meehan Hill, and it commands fine views across the Vale of Evesham. It's famous, by the way, in case you don't know, as the site of so-called Olympic Games founded by Sir Robert Dover in the early 17th century. And not only Dover's Hill and Western Subbage, but this whole area on the map, including Honeybourne, Mickleton, Meehan Hill, Blackminster, Evesham, and beyond it the Malverns, is border country. It's on the edge. Worcestershire, Warwickshire and Gloucestershire converge here, and England meets Wales in the Marches. A great Mercian monument marks that Anglo-Welsh border, of course, the 8th century Offa's Dyke. And in the chapter following that on Tolkien in my book, King Offa of Mercia will take centre stage as I turn to examine Geoffrey Hill's Mercian hymns. So in this paper, I've traced interconnections between landscape, family history, and scholarly interests, both Tolkien's and mine. In Tolkien's case, though not mine, these are all further connected with creative writing. But it's not only writers, whether critical or creative, for whom texts can be inseparable from places and the past. When our conductor advised my parents and me to alight at Honeybourne for Middle-earth, he was not only connecting a real with a fictional landscape, nor merely demonstrating knowledge of an author's family background. He was also seeing his own life and the land through which he was passing on that train as enchanted by belonging to a story. Readers, as well as writers, live in a world where past and present meet in places within tales. Thank you very much for your attention.